People have often said, oh, how did you have the time? And the truth is that it gave me energy.
So hi, welcome Tabitha.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Academy. So Tabitha, you're a second year trainee at Mishcon de Reya.
Yeah.
And also an author.
Yes.
Of the wonderful The Sons of Prophecy, a historical novel set during the War of the Roses.
Exactly, yeah.
So as there's no one better than the author to tell us about a book, tell us a bit more about the book.
Yes, so well, thank you for having me here. As you say, it is a historical fiction set during the War of the Roses, and it sort of particularly follows the life of Jasper Tudor, who is the uncle of Henry VII. I sort of refer to him as maybe the period's most overlooked protagonist because everyone's heard of the Tudors, but no one's heard of Jasper, or at least very few have. So really it opens in 1456, a year after the first unleashing of violence at the Battle of St Albans. So the country is teetering on the edge of civil war. Henry VI, who is on the throne, is slipping deeper into illness, and Richard of York is lurking in the shadows, ready to seize power. Jasper is half-brother of Henry VI, so his loyalties are very firmly with Lancaster. And yes, it then takes us through the next 30 years until the famous Battle of Bosworth, sort of seeing it through his eyes.
So, I mean, that period of time, the War of the Roses, there were a lot of very striking characters in that 30 years of conflict. So what particularly about Jasper struck you as being worthy of a sort of standalone novel?
It's a good question. I suppose it really goes all the way back to 2013 when I was watching the BBC's adaptation of Philippa Gregory's The White Queen. I was 16 and completely captivated by the drama and sort of luxury that I was seeing on screen. And with all the scheming and all the sort of complex characters, I suppose the sort of steadfast loyalty of Jasper really stood out. In comparison, there's a great quote that I have at the beginning of the book by a historian writing in the early 20th century, and he talks about how the care and affection Jasper bestowed on his father's nephew stands in stark contrast to the brutality surrounding them. And for me, that really captured it, because when everyone's switching sides and no one knows who's loyal to who, to have someone who stays consistent throughout this whole period is arguably quite rare. And I wanted to learn more, and I felt that it was a story that deserved to sort of be given a stage, given a platform for other people to read about it.
Yeah, excellent. And look, I mean, the War of the Roses is a tumultuous time in our history. Why do you think that people are still so fascinated with it as a period?
It's a good one, because I was talking to someone earlier today about it, and she was explaining that she, very staunchly a Yorkist, and was telling me about Richard Neville and the Kingmaker and all her enjoyment with that. And it is this thing, who really knows why, where people still now feel an affinity to one side or another. This is obviously very much from a Lancastrian perspective. But I think there's, I suppose, sort of the complexity, but very much the human nature at the heart of it. These are families turning on each other. You've got brothers-in-law fighting each other. You've got fathers doing a different side to sons. I think in that way we can almost we get drawn in by that personal element. And I think also maybe the scale of it. When you look at sort of the numbers involved in some of these battles, when you compare them to the population size at the time, it's a huge percentage of the population drawn in. When arguably the people at the top are quite a small number, but they bring in everyone. And I think that really still captures us, was it 5.5 centuries later? Because I think we're sort of, fascinated by how we might sort of have seen ourselves in those moments.
But I mean, and it comes out through the book very well, the brutality of a War of the Roses was in stark contrast with the age of chivalry before, where, if you were a rich noble and you lost a battle, you expected to be ransomed and kept as captive. Whereas in the Wars of the Roses, towards once you got to Towton and beyond, the slaughter, you chop the heads off of people you caught without a second thought, no matter how noble they were. And it was a particularly brutal time. Do you think that that's part of the interest that people have in it, that civilization seemed to sort of dissipate for 30 years?
Yeah, I think, we look back on that period where we see the kings and queens and all the sort of finery, and maybe you think that there was this sort of very much, chivalrous nature, as you say, with Knight to the Garter and all of that. But you're right, there is a lot of violence simmering under the surface. And I do think as a period, it sort of charts that shift. You made the good point for drawing out Taunton. Before that, you have people being ransomed because, that is what had been done beforehand. And then it's almost though by Taunton that the conflict had been going on for so long, at this impasse where you're having a battle and one side wins and then the next side wins. And it's sort of seen as, no, from here on out, there can only be one victor and there is no room for anybody else to be pardoned. And you're right, you just see this sort of swathe of, generations just then killed, even if they survive the battle. And so I think it is a real shift, but maybe it was because of how entrenched the violence had become that they saw no further way out. Because when you look forward to Henry VIII, especially in his early reign, he's very keen on the principles of chivalry and, being the Machiavellian prince. So I think it's maybe lost for a moment, but comes back. And I think maybe it's lost because of what's in front of them. And
one of the striking things, you almost lose track in the book of how many, for example, Dukes of Somerset who are beheaded. His father, son, brother,
all of them
gone.
And everyone's called
brutal.
Edmund or Edward or Henry. It is quite helpful, and maybe this is the other reason why Jasper stuck in me, is he is the only Jasper.
He is the only
Jasper. It makes
Jasper.
it very easy as the author to be like, well, at least we know what our protagonist is doing, because it's not Henry number 6 that's coming in.
Absolutely. And while the book is I guess focuses very much on Jasper and to some extent Henry, who becomes Henry VII, there are very significant roles in the book for Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, and Queen Marguerite, Henry VI's wife.
Yes.
And they're portrayed in the book as very strong characters in what was this particularly violent and frankly misogynistic time. What did you find interesting about them as characters?
So I'm glad you've pulled that out, because it was a very conscious decision. I was very aware that, I'm writing about a man's experience in the Civil War. And, there's been some great books recently that have put the focus back on women. Annie Garthwaite's Cecily is a brilliant example of that. And so I didn't want my book to have an absence of women, because I think that this period, although it's very much focused in historical records on what men have done, the women behind them are incredibly important, and no more so than Margaret Beaufort and Marguerite of Anjou. And I think for Margaret Beaufort in particular, I was very struck when I was doing my research and going to different places. I was at St David's Cathedral, where Edmund's body is buried. And there was a man who was having a very heated discussion with a tour guide, and the level of, I suppose, vitriol he was still speaking about Margaret Beaufort, calling her shrewish and scheming. And I was sitting there going...
Do people actually call people shrewish in this?
Well, yes, he did.
In the 21st century, I didn't know that.
Well, maybe not at that one, but yes, people still
history
are.
Buffs
History buffs still are about...
Right.
I was thinking, hang on, this is a woman who was 13 when she gave birth to her son, who successfully navigated, as you've said, a very tumultuous time of history, and becomes, she eventually becomes the king's mother, is the title she's given, and has a very prominent position in Henry VII's court. And I think there's quite a lot of, I suppose, maybe a misogynistic lens that has been she's been shown through, where it's sort of this fear of powerful women in history. And I think I was quite keen to try and separate that, because, there's other books sort of talk about her as having a hand in the deaths of the Princess in the Tower, and that, heightens this idea of her being sort of a fanatic. The only surviving portrait of her, she's sort of very penitent in prayer. It sort of suggests this idea of an older woman who is sort of obsessed by God. And certain books like Philippa Gregory sort of depict her in a similar way. She goes a bit further. She suggests there's a sort of illicit romance between her and Jasper, and then in a subsequent book has her murder Jasper on finding out he knows she killed the Prince of the Tower. Needless to say, this all didn't happen. When Jasper dies, out at the time considered old age of 65, which I hope is not spoilers to say that he does survive this book, Margaret is nowhere to be seen. She didn't kill him. But there's a great book by Nicola Tallis called The Uncrowned Queen, and she really picks apart sort of what we know about Margaret and what actually is more just, these sort of layers of propaganda and misogyny, because I think we have to, admire a very courageous woman.
And she had such a hard life. As you say, married off at 13, gives birth to her first child at 13, husband then dies. And then she actually marries into the Yorkist side of the conflict. Twice, I know.
She does very well at positioning herself in terms of thinking where might her what's going to best serve her family. And at times, you're right, it puts her diametrically opposed to where Jasper is and where her son is. But it's sort of playing the game. I talk that quite a strong theme in my book is this idea of fortune's wheel, constantly turning and bringing people up and then pulling people down. And she's almost trying to balance the scales. How can she make sure they benefit whichever turn? But that can't have been easy to, live with two husbands who are fighting against your son. That's not something that any mother would probably naturally want. And I think it sort of epitomises the topsy-turvy nature of the era, but also shows her resilience and what she's wanting to achieve.
I mean, obviously, spoiler alert, she does become
spoiler alert. I mean,
the king's mother. But the contrast with Queen Marguerite is stark, isn't it? Because so she was having to carry her husband who was seriously ill, mental health problems, and at times lead the Lancastrian cause, while all the time seeking to protect her own son, who Prince Edward, who was going to be the next king.
Yeah.
And it didn't end so well for her.
No, it doesn't. She arrives into England to marry Henry VI. It's this massive occasion, all this hope of what she'll be able to achieve. Her father, Duke Rennie, is a very proud man and is wanting his daughter to raise them up into this sort of echelons of the nobility. And, ultimately it all ends in disaster. As you say, she does, I think, a very good job at supporting her husband when he is incapacitated. And it's still unclear what illness he had, but it effectively left him unable to speak, unable to move, and so really incapable of doing anything. And she really does well in a strange country with not many supporters to try and keep things going. I think for her, it's almost, she takes a different approach maybe as a mother than Margaret does. For her, she keeps her son incredibly close. When they invade England, she doesn't let Edward go with them. And ultimately you can say that's why then at the Battle of Tewkesbury, they're always on the back foot through that and get forced into a battle they're not prepared for, which ultimately spells disaster for them. Maybe had she been more forthcoming and willing to push her son forward, that might not have happened. But I think she is also an example of, how fortune's wheel can spin and leave you much, much lower than you ever thought, you might have been.
I don't wonder whatever happened to her, because it's not.
I know.
It's not in the book.
No,
Maybe a spin-off.
She gets ransomed back to her father,
and that's
she
disappears from
just
history.
dies in relative poverty.
And heartbroken.
Yeah.
It's tragic. So the book is obviously written for a modern audience.
Yes.
But you're writing about times over 500 years ago when values and the rest of it were very different. So how do you keep the story authentic, but at the same time make it relevant to a modern audience?
Yeah, it was a difficult one because I'm conscious that I was wanting to attract a modern audience, and I was wanting to make it as widely sort of accessible as possible. So that lends itself to a certain type of writing, a certain language used. But at the same breath, I wanted historical accuracy. One of my aims in writing this was born out of frustration at reading similar books from the time period, and people are alive when they shouldn't be. And as someone that knows the period very well, it's endlessly frustrating when you're going, oh no, I'm sorry, you should have been dead 5 years ago. And other people might not notice it and brush over it, but for me, it's annoying. But I think, I as a person am influenced by the time I exist in and my values, and that very much then comes into the book. I haven't written this and completely removed myself from what I'm writing. My characters and my interpretation of these people, and so I've made certain brought maybe some sort of modern points of view in that maybe don't have a place then, but I think it can help, bring the reader along to make them empathise with people. I think, a balance should be struck, but I think if you go too hard for trying to completely fit with the ideals of the time, you might alienate people that might otherwise enjoy learning about a period, you know, it's interesting to think about how different opinions on things have changed. And I do think, you know, I have tried to draw out certain sort of people that might be holding those views, but have then tried to challenge them through other characters. So I think it's a constant interplay, a constant balance between, yes, how modern are you going to make it versus how true to the historical period.
But you haven't altered the stories and
I haven't
the
altered the story.
chronology in any way.
No, so that was...
As you say, when people do that, it is frustrating if you know. It's a very frustrating
really is.
thing to
I think, you know,
pick up.
Historical accuracy, I would say, is maybe a sliding scale. You know, you could be 100% historical accurate and then bore your reader to death, or you could be so loosely based that you're wondering why you even bothered to call it historical in the first place. I think the way in my historical note at the end, I sort of explain it as this idea of the space where fact gives way to imagination. You know, as we've said, it's 5.5 centuries. That's a long time to reach back across. And we'll never know the content of conversations like this had by probably fires in cold, drafty castles. But we do know the events that those conversations led to, the births, the marriages, deaths. And so I've used those events as a sort of stepping stone to sort of track the story through, to anchor it and guide the reader. And to get those sort of anchor points, I've then used the wisdom of a multitude of historians. There really are some amazing historians out there. And there's also been a lot more scholarship more recently on Jasper. And Terry Breverton is brilliant. He has a book on Jasper and a book on Owen. And that was, you know, a huge, brilliant resource to have. And that's really allowed me to sort of, almost each chapter, there's something happens that can be historically, you know, proven, and you have the records, and I can point to about 6 historians that say, you know, what happened.
But your research went beyond just academic research, didn't it? So, because you take some interesting stories about where you went. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yes. So I suppose, well, I should give a bit of context because I started writing this when I was doing my LPC. And so I had quite nice long holidays, still at that point, less so now. So I had the opportunity to go and visit a lot of these castles and the places where the story is set. I've dragged countless friends around Pembroke Castle, which is an amazing building. I love castles, I think, for the sense of just scale and almost your insignificance to history. I weirdly find it comforting. Don't know what that says about me, but there we go. But being able to visit them was wonderful. I'll admit that sometimes it was slightly out of order. So in certain instances, I wrote about the place before I visited it. And that was particular for Bamborough Castle. And so when I then visited Bamborough and I was standing on the beach looking up at it, and it really is an amazing fortress, and a very iconic shot, I feel, that beach look up to it. And I suddenly thought, oh no, I have captured this. I feel like I've done that justice because I'm feeling what I want the reader to feel. And that was a really satisfying moment of going, okay, no, I think I've got this. And then it's been lovely to discover the castles in Wales. I mean, there's such an amazing collection, and nearly every town has a castle. And so for one birthday, I got given membership for Welsh Heritage. So that got me entrance into all of them. And I took myself off on a Welsh road trip and went up to Denbigh and down to Harlech, and it was wonderful. I would recommend anyone, you know, who has a passing interest in history go and see these castles. It brings it to life.
I've been to most of them, so as a bit
but
of
not
a castle.
Pembroke yet.
But not Pembroke. Pembroke, no. I will go to.
Add that to the list.
And did you go to the battlefields at all?
I didn't. No. So that was the one thing I didn't do. I did toy with going to Bosworth. But in the end didn't manage it. I suppose I went through near where Mortimer's Cross happens. So I'd been to Hay, and then I'd driven up towards Ludford Bridge, Ludlow, all that. So I sort of got a sense of, I suppose, the distance we were talking about in terms of, okay, is that feasible, you know? And so I've got the sense of the geography, because I think that's really important, is that, you know, I did that road trip in a car, you know, without even thinking about it. Yeah, and so you've got to think, God, they've gone all the way from Mill Bay up to, you know, Shrewsbury, and what does that actually mean, you know, when you're on foot? And so I think, you know, visiting the places gives you that real sense of stuff. But no, I didn't make it to the battlefield, so maybe.
Yeah, St Albans is worth going to. First St Albans, because the street plan is still the same.
Is it?
Yeah, okay. So you can get a real feel for where that happened. Yeah. So we haven't really talked about, what prompted you to write the book,
Yeah.
because not many, solicitors or trainees actually write a book on something so unconnected with, their work, for example.
So I suppose, it's twofold. So one was sort of the immediacy was when I was doing my LPC, I didn't really feel like I had a creative outlet. I didn't study law at uni, I did anthropology, and that gave me a huge sort of outlet for my creativity because I was in control of whatever essay I wrote. And so that was really fun. And so then going into the LPC, it was just quite tramlined, as I'm sure many people can relate to. And I just needed something to escape into, and I suppose also something that wasn't assessed. I think it's sort of important to say that when I started writing this, there was no end goal in mind. I wasn't writing to go, oh, well, when I'm in my second year of my training contract, I will have a book. That was not the motivation. It was more just a curious experiment to see where it would go. So that was sort of what prompted it, that moment. And so that was 3 years ago, back in January 2022 was, what did that. And we'd had conversations over Christmas, the classic, oh, if you wanted to write a book, what would you write about? And I joked that considering the amount of research I'd already done, Jasper would be my subject. And I suppose that research and that interest actually starts way back, as I mentioned earlier, in 2013 with watching The White Queen. And what also interplayed with that is at the time, I was in lower sixth and my school had an essay competition and we had free rein to pick whatever we wanted. And so I wrote that essay on Jasper. And I remember going to my history teacher, Keith Hay, who is a wonderful man, and sort of being a bit nervous because, this was quite a left field subject to do. I couldn't, at the time, there was very few books on it. I remember the poor library staff had to go out, I think, to Cardiff Uni to get a thesis for me to actually read because there were about 4 books at the time. But Mr. Hay he smiled at me knowingly and was like, oh, Uncle Jasper, and was this huge sort of, his enthusiasm for it made me believe that it was a period that, I could explore and get interest in. And I suppose since then, it's just been every time I've gone into a bookstore, I've gone to the history section, I've gone to the War of the Roses, and I've picked up a book. And crucially, I turned to the reference pages because when I first started doing this, I would pick up a book and Jasper wouldn't be in the references. Or if he was, there'd be one reference to it. And then since 2013, I have seen a complete shift in how many books are mentioning him. Because the truth is you can't really talk about the War of the Roses in sort of its entirety without talking about him. He is so central to Henry VII coming to power. And so it's been exciting to see that change. I wonder how many other people were influenced by watching, or maybe it was the excitement around that BBC adaptation and people realising, oh, no one's written about him. Brilliant, there's the gap. I think also if I reflect back, I didn't realise it at the time, but my school actually had quite a lot of connections to the Tudor period because Margaret Beaufort's parents are buried at Wimborne Minster, which is the town where my school was. And there's still a school there called Queen Elizabeth School, and it was founded by Margaret. She also famously founded, I think it's 2 of the Cambridge colleges, but she also founded this school, and then Elizabeth I changed its name to the Queen Elizabeth School. But we used to play them in sport, and I didn't realise the connection at the time. And now I'm like, oh, maybe it was all subliminal.
And did you enjoy writing a book?
Yes, I loved it.
Because some people, it's quite hard to write a book. I wrote a very boring book a long time ago, still available, about facilities management contracts if you're interested. And it was very difficult. Was it easy for you?
I think there were points where it was difficult, but I think overridingly it was a lot of fun and I really enjoyed it. I think people have often said, oh, well, how did you have the time? And the truth is that it gave me energy. Writing wasn't something that was a drain on my time or a sort of thing to check off my to-do list. It was the thing I was excited when I woke up in the morning to sit with my cup of tea and to write a few lines, or coming back on the tube from lectures, scribbling down a few ideas on a notes page, or getting in the car and driving to these places. It really was this thing that just caught my imagination and was just, like I say, something to escape into. I had thought maybe when I started the training contract that would diminish, because I had a year off between my LPC and my training contract, which probably also helped with being able to write it a bit more. Gave me a purpose as well in a year where I otherwise would have been a bit directionless, which was lovely.
Was that during COVID?
No, actually, it was 1 to 22. So
Right,
no, the
just
world was
after.
open. So yeah,
Or starting to open.
starting to open.
Yeah.
But no, but that was lovely when, you know, I was working at a local farm shop, not very glamorous, but I was then, you know, in my other downtime, I was writing, which was lovely. But I think, yeah, it's just been something that just has always just really been something that I want to prioritise, that I've got joy from. And I think that was the key with it. You know, this was always about bringing happiness for me and bringing joy. And I think that had I not found it enjoyable, well, it never would have got here. And I think in that, I do have to sort of do a shout out to the support around me with my family and also friends as well, who have been so supportive. You know, I joke, people joke that you are your own worst critic. And to them I say, well, clearly you aren't an identical twin, because if you want brutal honesty, there's no one better than the person that spends their entire life being judged by your actions. So when I wrote the first part of the book, I sent it to my twin sister Liberty and waited with bated breath about what she would say. Because honestly, if she'd said, oh, Tabitha, this is awful, I wouldn't have written it, because, you know, she is the historian in the family. She did history at uni. And so I value what she thinks, and she would have been always honest with me. And instead she phoned me about 5 minutes later going, this is brilliant, you need to write some more. And so I think that excitement and enthusiasm from people directly around me also made me more excited to write it, because I knew that even if it was only my, you know, little close family unit, that they would be excited with whatever I did. And so that brought me joy as well.
In Tricks of a Trade, did you actually sort of draft out the whole book as you saw it would be, or did you just have sort of chapter headings, or how did you do it?
So I set out a plan at the beginning of The War of the Roses, and sort of I knew I was always going to start in 1456. That was clear to me.
Right.
You know, Edmund dies, and I'd already sort of just had this image of Jasper riding to Pembroke. I thought it was a good way of just opening, because I think, you know, the Battle of St Albans is very interesting, but it's quite complex how they get there, and it's all a bit messy, and sort of I think that's the danger with this as a period, is because it is so complex, it's how do you draw that out. And so I knew where I was starting, and quite helpfully, you know, 1485 was a very clear, you know, cut point, and that's recognised in the study of history as well, because I think the modern period starts in 1485. They needed an arbitrary line, that is the line, so it's very helpful there. So I had my endpoints. And then I suppose it was just going through and just, you know, pinning out the key battles and moments throughout that. And that's then what took the structure. And from that, when you read the book, you'll see that it's in parts, as you know. And so it was sort of thinking, okay, that can fit into this part and that can go in that part. And then once I'd sort of sectioned it out, because that just made it a bit easier to sort of put in my head, then I went into more detail. But I suppose I didn't have any idea of like chapter headings, but I did know that I almost needed each chapter to sort of have a reason to move the story forward. Because I'm covering a huge period in one book, I was very conscious about keeping the energy going, keeping the reader moving through.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, but it wasn't as meticulously planned as maybe someone starting a complete fiction book. You know, someone doing a fantasy book, I think, requires a lot more of that pre-planning in terms of characters. You know, I suppose the benefit you have from doing historical fiction where everyone is real is that, well, I can just go and look at a history book and just check, okay, that was how old they were, and that was some of the characteristics people say they have, and oh, look, there's a portrait of them, okay, brilliant. And suddenly that just helps fill in. Paint by numbers would be too simplistic, but it helps, you know, it does help, you know, fill in those gaps when you might otherwise have hit a writing block. And you also can't then write yourself into a corner, which I know is a problem for people with other genres, is, oh, we've killed off the person we really needed.
Right.
The benefit with historical fiction is it naturally sorts itself out. So,
and it's a book about the War of the Roses. Do you have to have knowledge of a War of the Roses to get the best out of it, do you think? Or do you think a lay person can pick it up and read it as an interesting novel
so
just in itself?
From people I've spoken to who have now read it, I know that if you have no knowledge, you can really enjoy it. And I think that was also quite a clear motivator behind sort of how I wrote and how I covered things. was I wanted it to do two things. I wanted someone like me or like you who very much knows the period to be able to read it and be satisfied and not have those frustrating moments, or at least I hope you didn't have any frustrating
None
moments.
at all.
Of going, oh God, why are they there? Why is that out of order? And so that was sort of my personal thing. So I want someone who's very knowledgeable to still enjoy it. But then I wanted people to not be put off, to learn about something new. I'm a big believer that historical fictions are a great way of introducing people to periods that they may not otherwise read about. I never formally studied this period at school. We did the bit after and we did the bit before, but we didn't do this bit. And so I've also learned a lot, as well as obviously from non-fictions, but from reading fictions. And there are some brilliant other books about this period. And so I would hope that anyone can read this and enjoy it. And I know my cousin Phoebe, she read it and very much enjoyed it as more like a sort of action, semi sort of magical thing of, she could almost imagine it with put a few wizards in and it could have been, a fantasy book. And that's absolutely fine. It's about getting the enjoyment from it, at whatever level you're reading it at.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of the themes in it, are universal themes which have applied throughout history, sort of greed and love, hatred.
Yeah.
And so people should be able to relate to them, no matter the fact that they're sitting in the 21st century and it's 500 years ago. It's the same issues that people face in life even now.
Exactly. And I think that was, very much what I wanted, because it's easy to look at those periods and be alienated by the different distance of time. And I didn't want that to be the case. And I think also that, as a period, we said it still holds people, the sort of fascination that it holds. And I think, you've got Game of Thrones and things like that have helped bring it into this thing of everyone's a bit aware of it. And I think,
Except there's no dragons.
There are no dragons. Despite the dragon on the front, there is no. The Welsh dragon is the only dragon that makes an appearance in the book, unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, so I think I got most of my knowledge of the War of the Roses from Shakespeare.
Okay, yeah.
And do you think Shakespeare is a good guide to the War of the Roses for people who may be coming to it new, or?
I think he can be good. I love Shakespeare's history plays. I particularly really enjoy Henry IV and Henry V, so just before. And I think they're quite useful in sort of understanding how you get to this point. Because I think that can sometimes be difficult. It's like, how did you suddenly get to the whole country at war with each other? I think when it gets into the War of the Roses part, you have to sort of recognise that Shakespeare is writing during Elizabeth I's reign. He is influenced by making sure that she is shown in the best light, which means showing showing the Tudors in a good light. I very much steered away. I mean, Richard III doesn't get mentioned much in my book. He's sort of there, but not. But I didn't want to try and lean into any of these ideas of sort of the evil hunchback of Shakespeare. And I think, very much in modern retellings, that's just sort of all been put to the side. You can understand why Shakespeare uses it as a device to sort of really make it clear to the audience, oh, this is a bad guy. But
he was a pretty bad guy, wasn't he? Let's be honest.
I mean, he did, yes. And I think that there's obviously huge conspiracy theories about who killed the prince in the tower. I haven't gone into that. I've just been like, Richard III or someone within his employ probably did. Whether it was a Thomas a Becket situation of,
it's kind of academic because he put them in the town in the first place.
Yes, it is kind of academic.
And took the throne, so,
Exactly. So, going back to Shakespeare, I think he is great to read about it, but he misses out quite a lot of key characters. Margaret Beaufort is barely mentioned at all. Jasper's not in it at all. Because of all the different generations of different nobles, he sort of simplifies some of them and combines two together. So I think that if you're wanting the detail of it, I wouldn't say Shakespeare's the best, but I think you're better watching it if you're already familiar, because if you're familiar with it, you can understand where he's combined things or gone off on a certain route. Whereas if you've got no knowledge, then it can be a bit overwhelming on that. But the BBC's adaptation of The Hollow Crown is brilliant, and
it's still on iPlayer.
It's still on iPlayer, yes. Other streaming services are available, but no, it's a good one. I think there are other as well. I've mentioned Philippa Gregory. I think she did a brilliant job at really bringing this sort of period into sort of just the wider society of people going, oh, that's an interesting period. And others like Con Iggulden have done similar. He's got a great quadrilogy. that basically takes the exact same period I've done but breaks it into 4, because the truth is there's a wealth of stuff that you could have done, and I could have, I don't know, dived deeper into it. But I think, so the reason for not doing that is probably because, you know, I self-published this versus having, you know, a big publishing house behind me going, oh, don't worry, Tabitha, here's an advance, go off, enjoy yourself.
Well, what is next, actually? Is it going to be Jasper Volume 2?
Well, there are still 10 more years of his life. Although, as we were chatting through before, maybe questionable how interesting that period of history was. I personally think it's quite interesting. You didn't sound so convinced.
No, I'll go with it.
But maybe I'll be able to make it exciting.
Exciting,
yes, because we have all the pretenders.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is that we come to it, sort of recognise the Tudors as being this solidly established dynasty. You know, Henry VIII can have all the sort of carnage and chaos of all his different wives, but there's never a question of, oh, well, he should be king. And I think that's really interesting, because when you look at how tenuous Henry VII's link was, and actually how fragile his initial years were, it is quite remarkable that we get to the next 100 years of of course, it's the Tudors. And so I think I would like to explore that a bit to understand, you know, what is it in those early years that cement him so much beyond sort of reproach in terms of getting rid of him, as they've done, you know, previously. And so, yes, so Jasper lives for 10 more years after Bosworth. So there is some interesting, you know, more to get. He gets married, you know, his life, he's made a duke. So there's lots of other stuff that, you know, could be explored. But I think, you know, it depends on what I have time for. I think what I'd love to do though is I've learnt so much from, you know, navigating the self-publishing world with this. I'd quite like to take those learnings and do it again with a sort of just better equipped, because I must admit, sort of this time around was sort of all a bit wide-eyed and going, oh, what typeset do I want? And oh, will that cover designer be good? Or I think it's ended up all right, actually. I'm very proud of what it was. Yeah, my
very, very good.
My cover designer is a man called Mark Swan, and I have to give him a shout out because he did a brilliant job. But that was almost luck. You know, you sort of put out these request quotes from sort of a random marketplace of strangers, and you hope that the person that comes back to you knows what they're doing, and he did. So
and where is the book available from?
The book is available really from anywhere. So you can buy it on Waterstones, on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, so all over the world.
They're in bookshops already then? So
they're not in bookshops. So this thing, they are available online. Right. I'm sure if you always support local. So if you were to go into a local bookstore and say, please could you order in this book, then they will be able to, because the details of it are on the central database that all bookshops use. My local bookshop, if anyone's from East Sussex and would like to go to the Wadhurst bookshop, then highly recommend. And they actually have physical copies, partly because my uncle walked in and gave them some copies and went, I've already bought these, you can now sell them yourselves. And actually my book is dedicated to my uncle, because I think that uncle-nephew dynamic, it very much runs through the book, and he's been hugely supportive of me throughout this, so it felt fitting to have that in mind.
Well, I bought mine.
Yes, you did.
So there you go. Very good it is too, worth every penny.